For those of you who don't know, Cinco de Mayo is an annual celebration that commemorates the victory of Mexican forces over those of the Second French Empire at the Battle of Puebla on that day in 1862. Cinco de Mayo literally means 5th of May in Spanish. Though the holiday has been celebrated in some form since then, it's gained much wider exposure in the last several decades. And it's actually celebrated more in the United States than in Mexico. But as with any cause for celebration, bad things can and do happen during it. Here are 5 stories about just that. Story 1. When I was a kid, I remember going with my parents to this one Mexican restaurant near to where my dad worked. I think it was called Tony's Cafe, but I'm not sure. I have a lot of fond memories there, both from the food and from going there with my brother and parents. However, there was one experience that was truly terrifying. For backstory, my dad supervised delivery drivers, and he'd frequently visit places where they deliver food, so he knew a lot of the people there. One time we went to the restaurant on Cinco de Mayo, and I think I was about 7 at the time. When we got there, it was completely packed, but luckily we were able to get reservations because my dad knew the owner. Soon after we walked in the door, one of the staff members greeted my dad and escorted us to our table. My mom and dad sat down on one side of the table, while I sat on the other side next to my 4-year-old brother, who I'll call Mark. I remember really liking their chips and salsa, and between the 4 of us, we'd usually finish a basket of it pretty quickly. Because it was spicy, that also meant we'd drink a fair amount of water, and eventually need to use the restroom. Sometime after the waitress took our order, my mom recommended Mark and I use the restroom before our food arrived. I didn't really have to go yet, but Mark did, so we got up to go to the little restroom in the back. My dad had left our table to go talk to someone, maybe the owner, I'm not sure. My mom stayed behind at the table, I think partly to show that we were still there and to prevent it from accidentally being given away. As we made our way to the back of the restaurant, where the bathrooms were located, Mark and I had to slowly wade through the people sitting at tables. The tables had been pushed closer together to accommodate the crowd. Unfortunately, the bathroom only had 1 stall and 1 urinal, and there were about 3 people ahead of us. So, we just got in line and stood there. Or rather, I stood there and had to hold on to Mark to prevent him from running away. About a minute later, some random man I'd never seen before came up to us and asked if we were waiting to use the restroom. I felt the answer should have been obvious, but Mark let out a "yeah" very emphatically. The man recommended that we use the other bathroom that we could get to from the patio behind the restaurant, saying that he was going there as well, and then he offered to take us there. I remember feeling uneasy, but perhaps it was because my dad knew the owner and that made us feel safe, or because I had to go to the bathroom too at this point, but Mark and I went along with him. The man firmly took my hand and led us towards the back door. I had Mark's hand and pulled him along. I remember the exit door was a large wooden door painted red, and I had been curious about where it went. The man slowly pushed the door open and appeared to look outside for a moment before leading us through. As I walked out, I looked around for the dining tables on the patio, since, from the man's description, I assumed that patrons could eat in this location as well. However, I soon noticed that there wasn't much besides old crates and boxes. I also distinctly remember the smell of old alcohol. I looked up at the man and asked him where the bathrooms were, and he looked down, smiled, and told me that they were right over there. He pointed his finger at an old, rusty, blue pickup truck, and I think this is where I started to panic. I tried to forcefully pull my hand away, but the man gripped it a lot more tightly and started making a shushing sound. I yelled at the man to let me go, but this time he didn't respond. We were almost to the truck, and he took out his keys and started to unlock the door. Just then the back door opened again and the man froze. One of the staff members was taking a box out. But when she saw us, I think she immediately realized what was going on. She yelled at the man to let us go, and then yelled back through the door to get the attention of her co-workers. Finally, the man let us go. He jumped into his pickup truck and floored it out of there. The woman came over to us and started crying, and a few seconds later, like 5 people busted out through the door. I think one of them went to chase after the truck, but it was already gone at that point. My mom and dad came out soon after that and were hysterical. After throwing his arms around us, my dad started talking to one of the other people outside, who I think was the owner. I don't think he was actually upset with him, probably because they were good friends, and my dad knew he'd never willingly allow something like that to happen. I don't think they ever caught the guy. The police did show up, and we gave a statement, but without the license plate number or more to go on, there wasn't a lot to do. No one they questioned at the restaurant had seen that man before or knew who he might be. The man who I think was the manager apologized again, and I'm pretty sure our meal was free. Eventually we went home, and I remember the car ride seeming very emotional and surreal. One of the scariest things about the ordeal was my brother Mark's obliviousness to the situation. Apparently he only realized after the man got in the truck and sped away that something was wrong. That night our parents and I sat down and had a big discussion on stranger danger, and I think I became a bit more mature that day. I also always wondered what would have happened if that staff member hadn't come outside right as that man was trying to drag us into his car, and it's still terrifying to think about. Story 2. This happened when I was in the 6th grade, and it's easily one of the most terrifying experiences of my childhood. This was right before Cinco de Mayo, and to celebrate the occasion, our social studies teacher was having us make dioramas about either the battle itself or something else to do with Mexican-American heritage. In typical fashion, I had procrastinated until the evening before it was due, and my mother wasn't pleased when I told her what I needed to have done for tomorrow. We did have a shoebox from one of my old pairs of shoes, but we didn't have enough supplies to make the decorations that went inside. I was planning to find something that could be used as a fort and toy soldiers to represent the two armies, as well as stuff to make trees and bushes. We had been given a rubric, but of course I had lost it, and at this point I didn't really care about getting points off. Luckily, or unluckily in this case, there was an arts and crafts store not far from where we lived. I figured that would have everything I needed, so after dinner we got into my mom's car and she drove me over. She was nice and told me I wouldn't have to use my allowance money, but to try not to overdo it. We parked in the parking lot and walked in through the automatic sliding doors, where I felt the cool air and smelled that distinctive smell. We started walking through the aisles, and I found most of what I needed fairly quickly. I remember it came down to me needing something to use for a fort and the toy soldiers. There was a Toys R Us in that same shopping center, so that was my backup plan, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. Around that time, my mom ran into someone she knew and struck up a conversation. She and the other person went over to look at picture frames, I think, but not before she told me that we need to leave in about 10 minutes. So I kept walking up and down the aisles, looking for those last two items. After striking out, I decided to ask one of the people who worked there. I was glad to see a man walking by in a vest, who I assumed worked at the store. He saw me look at him and came over, asking if I needed anything. I remember him being very overweight, having a bit of a neckbeard, and having a somewhat unusual body odor. After he walked over to me, I was genuinely surprised that he worked there. However, I didn't really care, and told the man what I needed. He then asked me what I was planning to make with it, and I told him I needed to make a diorama of the Battle of Cinco de Mayo, even though I don't think that's what it was officially called. To my surprise, the man actually told me that they had pre-made dioramas, and explained that they were sold as part of a kit and just needed to be painted. I figured I could probably half-ass it and just use marker or something, and I told him I'd definitely be interested. He said they only had a few left in stock and he'd have to get them in the back. He asked me if I wanted to come with him to look for them, and I readily agreed. We started walking to the employees only section by the back, but I picked up on the fact that the man seemed a bit paranoid, like he'd be constantly looking around, presumably to look for other people. When we got to the back, we went through a narrowish corridor to what I think was the break room. He then told me to wait there while he checked one of the stock rooms. I remember feeling self-conscious when the man left me alone in the break room. I thought another employee could come in at any moment and would think I snuck in or something. About 20 seconds later, the man came back in and told me that yes, they had one more of those in stock. But then he told me that I need to come with him to help him get it. That's when I started to get sketched out, as it didn't make sense to me why an employee would need the assistance of a kid to get something. I told him I'd rather stay in the break room, and he encouraged me to come with him, saying it would only take a moment and that I'd just have to hold him steady while he got up on a stool. I was torn between wanting to get this project over and avoiding danger, but I'm glad I made a smart decision for once. I told the man that my mom was waiting for me and that I needed to go. At this point, the man's expression changed. He had previously been smiling and had been very charismatic, but his smile changed to a frown, and I could tell he was now upset. At that moment, my fight-or-flight response kicked in, and I bolted back to the entrance of the employees' lounge. To my horror, the man ran immediately when I ran, and as I opened the door to run outside, he managed to grab my shoulder. I instinctively shouted, and the man let go. He said something like, "Wait," or "I'm sorry." but I kept running and made it back through the door to the employees-only area. There apparently weren't many employees on duty right now, so I had to go through the store looking for someone. Eventually I came to my mom and the lady she'd been talking to, and they could automatically tell something was wrong. I explained that there was a creepy man who told me to follow him to get one of the items I needed, and the lady immediately radioed the other workers at the cash registers. She escorted my mom and me to the front, and then she and one of the male workers made their way towards the back. Apparently the man was still there when they got there, and I was able to overhear them talking. The two workers were questioning him loudly as to what he was doing there, and he tried coming up with some bullshit excuse, like how he usually worked at another store, but had been sent over here for training today. I don't think either of them bought it, and 5 minutes later 2 cops showed up and began to question the man as well. Eventually they led him out of the building in cuffs. One of the cops had me give a statement, and afterwards my mom and I left the store. My mom, who had been on the verge of breaking down this entire time, kept hugging me as we sat in the car. We both started crying, and then drove home after that. When we got back, my mom took my dad aside and explained what had just happened, and though I think he got a little upset, he was just glad I was safe. About 30 minutes later I got to work on my diorama, and after I woke up and finished it the next day, it actually turned out decent. I ended up cutting, folding, and taping some of the construction paper I got to make the forts, and cut out little soldiers from the construction paper too and taped them to the bottom of the shoebox. In addition to the decorations I got from the store, I put some dirt and leaves in the bottom to try to make the ground more realistic. I think I even managed to pull out the yay, maybe because I still had some adrenaline in my veins when I went up to give my report. In any case, the whole experience stands out vividly in my mind, and I'm just glad that it all turned out okay. Story 3. The story takes place a few years ago on Cinco de Mayo, and it was one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me. Me and 3 of my college friends, who all called Dan, Nikki, and Paul for the purposes of this story, would sometimes set up a campfire and sit around just drinking and talking. This night was no exception, and as an added bonus, one of the cities nearby was going to set off fireworks. We got our stuff together and parked nearby on the side of the road around 8. We then carried the chairs, cooler, and firewood down a dirt path to a little clearing next to a creek and started setting up. After Dan got the fire going, we all relaxed in our chairs, drinking and having a good time as usual. The fireworks started right around 9, and though we were kind of far away, we could still see them. We were also buzzed at that point, which helped us celebrate. However, about 5 minutes after the show started, Paul asked the group if we heard something. Initially we thought he was referring to one of the fireworks, but then he clarified that he heard something moving around our little camp. We started to panic, thinking it was the cops, and Dan and I debated about putting out the fire. We'd probably come here about 20 times over the past several years, and had never seen anyone else. Though with it being Cinco de Mayo, perhaps the cops were patrolling the area, looking for people drinking or shooting off fireworks illegally. After a few moments, Dan and I hastily put out the fire, while Nikki and Paul started to collect the bottles of empty beer and put them back in the cooler. To put out the fire, we were filling a jug with creek water, and overall we were making a fair amount of noise. A minute later we were all sitting there in almost complete darkness, with only the dim moonlight and distant fireworks to light up our surroundings. During this time we had kept listening for anyone who might have been walking near us, but we hadn't heard anything. We were also thinking it could have just been an animal, as there were deer and coyotes in this particular area, in addition to things like raccoons and foxes. Dan, Nikki, and I were debating about whether or not we should just stay put and keep drinking and watching the fireworks, when Paul shushed us. This time I heard it too. It sounded like someone took one big step in a mud puddle from about 50 feet away and then stopped. I told Dan and Nikki that I heard it too, and we started looking around. Eventually we figured out that it was probably coming from the edge of the creek, as it hadn't rained recently and the rest of the ground was dry. When we couldn't find who or what made that sound, we all reached an understanding that we should go. Each of us picked up a chair while Paul got the cooler. But as Paul, Nikki, and I were starting to walk back up the trail, Dan let out a scream. We turned around instantly, and the image I saw is still burned into my retinas to this day. There, standing on the other side of the creek, was some thing that looked to be about 8 feet tall. It was only lit up by the moonlight and fireworks, but I could tell it wasn't human. I expected it to lunge at us or make a sound, but instead it just stood there, motionless. Honestly, that made it more terrifying, and none of us waited another microsecond before booking it back through the dirt path and getting to Dan's car. Somehow none of us had dropped what we were carrying, so when we got there, we just opened the doors, threw the stuff inside, and got inside ourselves. Dan floored it, and on the drive back none of us really talked. 15 minutes later we arrived at Dan's house. He parked in his garage and closed the door, and we all went inside, and he made sure the doors and windows were locked. I don't think any of us actually expected that creature to have followed us, but I also think we were all terrified of the possibility. Only after we made sure the house was secure did we let out our collective breath. Nikki, who was the relatively quiet person in our group, broke the silence with a nervous laugh. I still remember he said, "Dude, what the was that?" We talked it over for a while, and eventually came up with theories as to what that thing might have been. Paul suggested it might have been an optical illusion caused by the dim light and the fact that whoever, or whatever, was standing in the creek. Mind you, the creek was about 40 feet across, but only a foot or two deep at that location. Dan suggested it was just someone playing a prank, with some kind of a costume on. I'm not sure how much we believed either of those theories. After all, why would someone randomly come to that location in the forest and walk halfway through the creek just to mess with people that they wouldn't even know would be there? We also thought about the possibility that it was one of our other friends, but to be honest, we weren't super close with anyone else, and no one we knew would do anything like that. I'm not sure we said it explicitly, but I'm pretty sure we all considered that what we witnessed could have been paranormal. Personally, I never believed in the supernatural, but after seeing that thing, I honestly don't know what to think. Either way, we never went back to that location again, and instead we just have our campfire and sit around drinking in Dan's backyard. I also got married to my then girlfriend, and we moved to a new house, and then I'd commonly host the guys as well. The topic of what we saw that night still comes up from time to time, and when it does, we all get uneasy. Part of me wonders that, if I went back there, would that thing be there too? Story 4. Last year my best friend Ashley and I took an Uber to one of the Cinco de Mayo celebrations, near where we went to college. I don't want to give a lot of specifics, but I'll say that as we live in Texas, Cinco de Mayo is pretty widely celebrated. This particular celebration took place in a town square, with local business owners setting up booths, and performances by some of the nearby school bands. There were also a fair number of restaurants serving authentic Mexican food, and overall it was a very pleasant, more laid-back experience. That is, until we ran into one person. For additional context, Ashley and I had grown up in the same town, which was also relatively close to the one we were currently at. We were both sophomores in college, and while we weren't in the same dorm, we were still very close and made sure to keep up with each other. Another reason why we went to this festival, and why what happened was so unfortunate, was that Ashley had recently broken up with her long-term boyfriend and hadn't been in a good place. This was one of the first bigger social gatherings she'd gone to after the breakup. I'll skip a lot of the unnecessary details and fast forward to around 6 o'clock or so. We'd been visiting the booths, having conversations, and taking part in various activities. This included little trivia contests and a few rounds of cornhole that a group of people had set up. We'd also run into a few people that we hadn't seen in years, and so had some catching up to do with them. After all that, we were finally getting hungry for dinner, so we decided to pick one of the 3 or 4 restaurants to go to. That's when a man came up to us and asked us how we were doing. He introduced himself as Carl, and told us that he thought we were very pretty, and so he had to come over and tell us. Now, a couple things probably factored into our initial reactions. First, we'd been drinking a bit, Ashley more so than me, so we'd loosened up a bit. Second, Carl, or whatever his name was, wasn't half bad looking. He looked to be around our same age, early 20s, and was clean shaven and dressed in relatively nice clothes. And third, for me, I was just glad Ashley was being sociable. Indeed, Ashley and Carl seemed to be flirting with each other and apparently hitting it off, and a few minutes later we decided to all get food as a group. Carl said that he lived here and knew the absolute best place to eat. Ashley and I joked that we really only wanted tacos and queso, and Carl made a point to tell us that this restaurant had the absolute best tacos and queso around. We asked Carl to point it out to us, since we were still standing in the town square and thought that he was referring to one of the restaurants nearby. Carl shook his head and told us it was a few blocks away. Ashley and I started to pout and complain that it was too far. Carl offered to drive us, and I think here is where the encounter started to feel off to me. I'm not sure if it was the way he said it, but something in his voice sounded insincere. I don't know what exactly, I couldn't put my finger on it. Ashley didn't seem to pick up on anything though, and I didn't feel confident enough to voice my concern. Ashley asked him where his car was, and Carl told us that he had to park a block or two away, since when he'd gotten here earlier, all the nearby parking was taken. I guess that could make sense, and we started walking in the direction apparently leading to Carl's car. I still don't know why, but I was becoming more suspicious and a bit concerned. So I asked Carl where the restaurant he wanted to take us to was, and he pointed in almost the opposite direction. I suggested we just walk there instead, and for a moment I thought I saw him frown. And it wasn't just an ordinary frown, no, he seemed genuinely upset by what I just said. Then a moment later he began smiling and flirting again, and said of course we should just walk straight there. I decided to ask Carl more questions, while trying to hide the fact that I was suspicious. I asked him the name of the restaurant, as well as how long he'd lived here, where he worked, and where he went to school. I won't share the specific answers he gave, so as not to associate random people with this man, but I will say that the answers he gave sounded reasonable. After a while, Ashley and Carl started joking that I was asking him a lot of questions, and trying to be protective of her. And I tried to just laugh it off, while all the while hiding my doubts. At this point we were already about a block away from the town center, and it didn't appear that there would be any other restaurants or businesses nearby. Instead, we were moving into some kind of sketchy industrial area. It then occurred to me to use my phone in the Maps app to search for the restaurant name Carl had told us, and as I suspected, it didn't come up. I decided to go ahead and confront Carl, telling him I couldn't find the restaurant. He immediately seemed upset and his eyes flashed again, but a moment later he was all smiles. He told us that he might have misremembered the name, or maybe they weren't online because they were a smaller restaurant. I could read him like a book, and I was becoming both afraid and annoyed at his behavior. I deliberately stopped walking, and I told him I'd feel better about taking an Uber. Maybe Ashley was starting to sense something too, because she stopped walking as well. For a moment it looked like Carl wasn't sure what to say, and then he started strongly encouraging us to keep following him. He told us that the restaurant was just around the corner. At that point I wasn't buying it though, and as if I needed more proof, a moment later Carl said, "Don't follow me." Ashley and I automatically determined that we needed to walk back to the town square, and we started backing up away from him. Carl started yelling at us, but thank God he didn't follow us. We continued walking, not running, and kept our eyes on him as we went away. Though he didn't follow us, he did do something else that freaked us out. Eventually he stopped yelling, and then took out his cell phone and appeared to call someone. It also seemed like he was looking around for whoever he was talking to. We were terrified that either Carl would start charging at us, or someone else would pop out from behind a building, and that walk back to the town square was the most tense time in my life. Thank God we made it back without incident, and after making sure we were in a place with a lot of people nearby, I called an Uber. Luckily the driver was an older, Hispanic lady, so it didn't seem like she'd be associated with Carl at all. I thought about telling her what just happened, but decided against it, and instead we just went back to our college. Looking back, I really hated that that experience ruined what was otherwise a really good time, especially with Ashley still getting over her breakup. I can't be sure what Carl was planning, but whatever his intentions were, they weren't good. It just goes to show that you can't be too careful, and being aware of your surroundings and listening to your inner voice can make all the difference. Story 5. My wife and I didn't really celebrate Cinco de Mayo before we moved into our current house about 5 years ago. I'm not sure if it's the entire city or just our particular neighborhood, but a lot of the people by us would sit around in lawn chairs on their driveways, talking and drinking. We actually really enjoyed the ambience the first year we moved in, as it allowed us a chance to meet many of our neighbors we hadn't seen before. However, the second year there almost completely ruined the holiday for us. You're about to hear why. It was actually truly terrifying. Cut to around 9 p.m. on Cinco de Mayo, and someone in our neighborhood started shooting off fireworks. I'm not sure exactly where in our neighborhood they were doing it, but it didn't sound really close. My wife and I had been visiting with various people outside in their driveways, including the couple that lived 2 houses down, and we had just gotten back to our own house. I had work the next day while my wife had off, and I was on my laptop answering emails while I think she was watching TV in bed. The sound of the fireworks wasn't bothering us, and in fact I actually liked it, but a few minutes later someone started banging furiously on our front door. My wife and I both jumped up and met in the living room. I was about to say loudly, "Who's there?" when whoever was pounding on the door abruptly stopped and shouted, "I'm hurt bad, let me in." Of course my wife and I weren't just automatically going to do that, so I said, "Where are you hurt?" The person replied, "I hurt my hand on fireworks, just let me in." I told him, at least I assume it was a him, that I'd call 911, to which the man said, No, it's okay, just let me in." That solidified it in our minds that the man wasn't really hurt and was instead most likely trying to break in. Just as I was about to tell him to get lost and start cussing him out, my wife turned her head and let out a scream. A moment later I saw what she was looking at. The doorknob on the back door was turning. Of course this meant that whoever was at the front door was working with someone, which increased the level of terror significantly. I screamed I was calling the cops and to get the F off my property. Apparently the man didn't take a hint, as he resumed banging wildly on our front door. My wife was hysterical as she dialed 911 and followed me to our bedroom. I locked the door and went to unlock the handgun we kept in a secure location in our closet. My wife started talking to the operator as she pushed our dresser against the bedroom door, but no sooner had she done so than we heard the sound of shattered glass coming from the vicinity of our living room. The whole experience was so surreal, and I was still coming to terms with how quickly things escalated when my wife screamed again as our bedroom door started banging against our dresser. Whoever was inside was now literally trying to break down our door. The operator told us to stay calm and advised that we wait in another room with a lock while the police arrived. The only problem was that neither our closet nor bathroom had a lock on it, and the doors to both rooms opened inwards to our bedroom. I figured we might as well make our stand there, and I loaded my gun. A few seconds later, the heaving at our bedroom door stopped, but to our absolute horror, about 10 seconds after that, the glass to our bedroom window shattered. My wife screamed for a third time, as I saw a man's face appear through the hole in our window. Now, I'd completed the gun safety course, but I haven't actually fired a gun in my entire life. When my wife and I got married, I decided to get a gun, as I would be the man of the house, and might theoretically have to protect us in a situation like this. But I never thought it would actually happen. Now I was face to face with an intruder, and I tried to will my body to raise the gun. The man and I just looked at each other, and in that moment time seemed to stop. Without actually raising my gun, the man ducked back out of the window. Only after he receded from my view did I appreciate how fast my heart was racing. The men apparently left after that, and when we finally heard sirens and the cops came inside, we unbarricaded our bedroom door to find our house had been trashed. That said, it didn't appear that anything valuable had been stolen, perhaps because whoever broke in left abruptly after they realized I had a gun. As we learned later, 2 other attempted break-ins were reported in our neighborhood, with the same story about someone being injured by fireworks. As to why those people finally decided to break into our house, I have no idea. For a good few months, my wife and I were on edge, and I'd constantly awake from nightmares of staring down that man again. A bit of counseling and several years later, I think things have pretty much gotten back to normal. But it still terrifies me to think what might have happened if I hadn't been able to defend myself and my wife.